rules. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's Chris from Rad Dad Rules, and I'm very excited to be here today with Dr. Chudler. Dr. Chudler, welcome. Excited to have you.
Thanks.
I want to introduce Dr. Chudler. He has a very long and impressive set of accomplishments here. I'll only get to a few of them, but a few things I wanted to talk to. Dr. Chudler did grow up in Southern California, as well as Malaysia and Japan. He has an undergraduate degree in psychology and a Ph.D. from University of Washington, where he is now the executive director, make sure I get this right, of the Center of Neurotechnology, as well as a faculty researcher in the Department of Anesthesiology and Pain Medicine. What you may know Dr. Chudler for most, though, he's reached out for 25, 30 years now, educating kids, scientists, teachers, even Buddhist monks and nuns on neuroscience and making it really accessible to all of us, so we can all understand how our brains work and use that power to our advantage. He's also has an award-winning website, Neuroscience for Kids. We'll include links below to that. My son loves that every week, and I'm sure yours will as well. And a Northwest Emmy award-winning show, BrainWorks. With that, welcome, Dr. Chudler. We're glad to have you.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah, you bet. So we had some questions from our dads. I wanted to go through those and jump in, if that's all right.
Sure.
The first one is, and this one came up the most, is why should we teach kids about their brains?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons. First of all, we've all got one. And so just it's an inherently interesting thing to think about and to know about. I think it's a good introduction to science in general. We all walking, talking organisms. And so it's easy to test them and to get ourselves interested in them. Unfortunately, we will all probably know someone with a brain injury or with a disease of the brain, a friend or a relative. So I think that all people, not only kids, by knowing more about how the brain works, perhaps we can feel closer to those people, maybe even help direct their therapy and treatment. Kids are also supposed to know about the brain. There's something called the Next Generation Science Standards that are used throughout the country to create local guidelines and benchmarks for kids to know about certain things. The brain is mentioned in there, so kids should be learning about the brain. I also think that it's very important just to be literate, to be able to read a newspaper or a magazine. It's difficult to pick up a newspaper or magazine without reading about the brain. So I think by understanding the brain, we'll be able to read and critically analyze some of the things that we read. So I think just for basic science literacy, it's important that we know about the brain. And finally, I think that a lot of the future decision-making is going to revolve around the brain. And what I mean about that is that courtrooms, for example, are going to be bringing up a lot of evidence that draws from neuroscience, for example, brain imaging. And lawyers these days are using those types of data to sway juries one way or the other. So I think that if people knew more about the brain, how to analyze and think about some of that research, that it would allow people to make better decisions. So I think for society reasons, for education reasons, and just for general interest, neuroscience is something that everyone should know about.
Right. That makes sense. So for a lot of us, we hear the word neuroscience and we can be intimidated, right? So any suggestions on parents for how to start and some things to maybe do or not do when they're teaching their kiddos about neuroscience?
Yeah, I think the first thing is perhaps get rid of all the jargon. Every division, every field of science has their own words for different things. And I don't think that's all that's necessary. What I think that's best to get an introduction to neuroscience is to do. And that is do an experiment. There's lots of easy experiments to introduce people to the nervous system. Things related to our senses. I mean, we're all walking, talking laboratories. So it's easy to test our senses, to test our memory, to test, how our brains work. There are lots of easy experiments just to get people interested. So I think by doing is a good way to get kids interested. Not just reading, not memorizing facts and figures. That's really not what's important. But I think by understanding how science works, the process of science is the way to go. And that's by doing experiments.
Nice. That's great. So I segue a little bit here. I've watched some of your YouTubes where you've taught Tibetan monks brain science. One of the ones that made me smile was you had an egg and some water and some sort of thing and dropped it. And just how engaged that audience was really exciting. Anything you can share from that or takeaways you had from teaching that audience?
Yeah, well, this is a program that I was invited to participate in. It's a program called Science for Monks, and they have scientists from Europe, from the United States, come over to teach the monks. And most of the monks have very little science background, if any, and so they're really novice scientists. Yet they're very deep thinkers. And so they appreciate learning new things, and they have an aptitude to really absorb that type of information. But because they are new to science, it's not only the basics of how the body and the nervous system works, but you have to make learning easier by not using a lot of those difficult words. And so it's a different audience because they are so new to science in general. But they are very interested and very appreciative of learning new things. And so a lot of the things that I developed for Neuroscience for Kids, I use those to teach the monks about how the nervous system works. And what I received from them is they have a very different way of thinking about things. One of the biggest questions that remain, I think, in neuroscience and brain research is consciousness. Western science has done a very poor job, I think, of understanding consciousness. And the Tibetan monks, they have a very different view of what consciousness is. And I think that what perhaps they can provide is a new way of thinking for Western scientists to use to get at the question of what is consciousness. And so not only when I go to India to teach the monks, do I provide them with information, but they're also my teachers, in that they're providing me with a different way of thinking about the brain. So it's really a two-way street with me teaching them and them teaching me.
That's powerful. That's awesome. Thank you. I noticed on your bio, you work with medicinal plants and have made some discoveries there. Anything you'd like to share? And are you seeing any alternatives, not to carry it too far, but to traditional pharmaceuticals? Anything there you can share with us?
Well, I'm just starting some new experiments. I'm trying to get some funding to look at some of the medicinal properties of cannabinoids. And cannabinoids are those chemicals that are produced from the marijuana plant. And across the United States, there are many states that not only do they allow medicinal use of cannabinoids, but here I'm in Seattle, Washington, where recreational marijuana is now legal. So many states are legalizing marijuana, and there's a large interest in cannabinoids as possible medications. It's also possible that some of these derivatives, some of these chemicals that you get from the plant, they haven't been completely tested, and there's a lot of information out there that may or may not be true. So you may have heard of things called cannabidiol, which is abbreviated CBD, and it's being put into drinks. It's all over the place, and there really hasn't been much testing on it. And so I'm interested in not only the potential medicinal properties of there, but are there any safety issues involved with some of these cannabinoids? And so these cannabinoids are used for everything from pain to multiple sclerosis to all these different treatments. And whenever I hear about one particular drug or chemical being used for so many different things, I'm a little bit skeptical. And so I'm interested in not only the potential medicinal properties, but also I'm looking at some of the safety issues, developmental issues that might arise from some of these things. So I don't have anything to share right now, a little bit early.
Right. Makes sense. Segueing a little bit, one of the questions we had was from your perspective, from a scientist perspective, what is intelligence? What's going on in our brain when we say intelligence?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think if you ask 10 different people, what does it mean to be intelligent? I think you get 10 different answers. And I think a good way to answer that question would be to think about what is not intelligent. And what I mean by that is when people have problems, what happens to their intelligence? So for example, many of us might have older relatives who have Alzheimer's disease. So what are some of the characteristics of Alzheimer's disease? Well, it's an issue having to do with thinking, problem solving, in many cases language, there's confusion, things like that, being able to control emotions. So those are problems that happen when people have trouble with whatever we call intelligence. So, and now if we reverse that, and you ask what is intelligence, I would say it would be just the opposite of what people have when, for example, when they have Alzheimer's disease. People are able to think clearly. They're able to speak properly. They're able to make decisions without a problem. They don't get confused. They're able to learn and memorize things. And those are all problems that people with diseases of the brain have. So it's not easy. I don't think that intelligence is related to someone's grade point average in school. I think that intelligence tests are not always the best way to measure someone's intelligence. So it's a good question. It's one that's been asked for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And I think that everyone's definition of intelligence is going to be different. But I think that if we look at people that have problems, for example, memorizing, learning, problem solving, those are the types of things that people would, whatever you say good intelligence is, that's some of the characteristics that they show. Nice.
Okay. Makes sense. Next 10 years or 20 years in neuroscience, what are some new things coming out or some things that we're going to see more of as lay people? What are you excited about that's coming in the next 10, 20 years?
Yeah, well, at the Center for Neurotechnology, we're making some good progress having to do with spinal cord injuries and some new therapies and some new treatments to help people that have damage to their spinal cords. So if someone has an injury of the spinal cord, their brain might be perfectly fine. But the messages from the brain to the rest of the body can't get through because the spinal cord is injured. And similarly, the other direction, all of the sensation from the skin below the injury doesn't get to the brain. So a person is not only paralyzed, but they also can't feel any of their limbs. And so I think that in the future, we're going to be making some very good progress helping people regain some of the motor function, being able to move, and perhaps restoring some of that sensation as well. I also think that there's going to be a lot of progress integrating machines with our nervous systems. That is, with either implants to help with people with therapy, or maybe to improve people's memory. And so this would be implanting of wires or a computer chip that somehow is able to talk to the brain, and the brain talks back to the chip, which then talks to a computer, which then is able to access information. So that can be used not only for therapy, for things like stroke or ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or Lou Gehrig's disease, but maybe even for entertainment purposes. So back in the old days, my very, very first computer was one, I had an original IBM PC, which I didn't even have a mouse. To move the cursors on a screen, I had to hit that arrow button to go across or down. And then Apple came with a mouse to navigate on the screen. And now on our touchstones, we just touch and we're able to navigate. Well, what if the next generation of computers or devices was directly linked to our brains? So all we had to do was think about something, and that would have that action appear on our screens. That would free our hands, and maybe it would be directly related to our thoughts. And some people might say, well, that brings up whole other issues. If our thoughts are being transmitted over the airwaves, could someone has access to those? Could someone hack those signals? And those are all very, very important considerations. So it might make our lives easier, but it also might bring up a lot of problems as well.
Right. Certainly make it interesting, that's for sure.
And it goes back. It
Go
goes
ahead.
back to our original conversation is why is it important to know about the brain? Well, these devices are being built. This is not science fiction. There are a number of companies that are building these things. And whether us as a society wants those things, we have to make some decisions. And we need to weigh the benefits of having these things built versus the disadvantages. Are we giving up privacy? What kind of security are there? Are we giving up some of ourselves when a machine is attached to our brain and that information from our brain is going to someplace? So we as a society have to understand what these devices can and can't do, and some of the risks and benefits to this new technology. Who should have access to them? Are they going to be expensive? If it does improve our memory, are only people who can afford these devices, will they get one? And so will this create an even greater divide, or will it create new classes of people, those who have these things versus those who don't? So these are all issues that are really coming to the forefront, and we as a society have to make some decisions about where this research is going.
Absolutely. So you brought up so many great points and stuff I think a lot of our listeners can be excited about. What's a great way for them to stay engaged or engage their kids, and with all the learnings you have and all the wealth of knowledge that's there? You have any suggestions?
Sure. Well, you mentioned up at the top that I send out a newsletter once a month. It's just sort of things that come to my mind. And if people want to get on that newsletter mailing list, just send me an email. Perhaps you can put that link to my website, which then has a link to the newsletter. I don't share email addresses with anyone. You only get that single email from me once a month at the start of the month. And so that's a good way to do things. Another activity that I think that I'm involved with, and in fact, your viewers, no matter where they are in the entire world, in March, there's an International Brain Awareness Week. And this is where scientists and neuroscientists, clinicians, they get out of the labs or they get out of their clinics and they interact with the public by having open houses, by having public lectures and things like that. And it happens in March. And I do one at the University of Washington. I invite about 800 kids to the University of Washington for an open house. But these are events that are going on all around the world. It's coordinated by the Dana Alliance in New York, and the Society for Neuroscience also gets involved. And so March is really a great time because there's lots of activities going on everywhere in the world to highlight what's going on in brain research.
That's awesome. Well, again, Dr. Chudler, I can't thank you enough. Again, all the work you've already done, but also educating our viewers and engaging a whole new class of folks excited about neuroscience. Again, thank you so much for your time today, and we wish you the very best.
Great. Thanks for having me again, Chris.